Happy Pride, readers. Welcome to Pride Book Fest. My name is Jacob, he, him, and they, them. I am a theater director and producer who turned to screaming about queer books on the internet at the start of the pandemic. And I'm also the co-founder of Pride Book Fest. I'm so excited today to bring you the college year's discoverability of queer lit for new and young adults. In this panel, we'll tap into the ongoing discussions about college set books, bridging the gap between YA and adult audiences, new adult as an age demographic, and the necessity of college set books with college age protagonists, especially for queer audiences. We hope to answer the question, how do queer college age readers find books about themselves? Within this conversation, we have authors, agents, influencers, and editorial points of view, so we hope to highlight how the publishing industry frames these stories as well. So let's meet our panelists.
Hi, I'm Dahlia Adler. My pronouns are she, her. I am the author of a whole bunch of books by now, actually. My most recent is called Cool for the Summer, which is sort of like bisexual YA Grease with better life choices. And I do also have a college set new adult book called Out on Good Behavior. In addition to writing and editing anthologies, I have edited two so far called His Hideous Heart and That Way Madness Lies. Which are both YA. I am the founder of a site called LGBTQ Reads, which curates books for all readers of LGBTQ plus everything. So come on over to lgbtqreads.com and find yourself a good book.
Hey, I am Arvin, pronouns are he, him. I'm the author of 3 books, Down and Across, Girl Gone Viral, and most recently, How It All Blew Up. How It All Blew Up is the story of 18-year-old Amir Azadi, who is gay and Iranian and Muslim. And when he gets blackmailed his senior year of high school for being gay at his new school, he ends up running away on the day of his high school graduation and winds up in Rome. And over in Rome, he has this incredible summer of adventure where he meets other queer people and, goes on dates in the Sistine Chapel and is out late dancing on Italian rooftops. But that whole adventure comes to an abrupt end when his family finds him there and they get into a big argument on the airplane. And so at the beginning of the book, you meet all of them, Amir, his mom, his dad, and his sister, in airport interrogation rooms where they all have to tell their side of the story.
I'm Zabe / I write as ZR Eller. I'm a literary agent at the Jennifer D. Gower Literary Agency, and I write YA and adult fiction, and my YA contemporary debut, May the Best Man Win, just came out in May, and it's the story of a trans boy challenging his ex-boyfriend for Homecoming King.
All right, I'm T.S. Ferguson, he, him. I've been an editor for the past about 15 years. I've worked with authors like Chris Beam, Robin Talley, Sandra Mitchell, Hilary Monahan, Nicholas DiDomizio, and as of this week, I'm now a literary agent as well. I'm with the Azantean Literary Agency.
I am Julian Winters. My pronouns are he, him. I am a young adult author of contemporary fiction. My books include Running with Lions, How to Be Remy Cameron, The Summer of Everything, and my forthcoming novel is Right Where I Left You, and it comes out in spring of 2022. My latest novel, The Summer of Everything, Somewhere Back There, is about a recent high school graduate by the name of Wes Hudson. He is a Black gay comic book geek who plans to spend his summer doing nothing but chilling at the independent bookstore he works at with his slacker friends, and also finally confessing his feelings for his friend. And all of his plans get upended when he finds out that a coffee shop franchise is coming in to buy and shut down the independent bookstore. So now he has to spend his summer with his friends trying to find a way to save the bookstore. So it's a little bit of Empire Records meets Make It Gay and very inclusive.
Amazing. So to start, most contemporary young adult books are set usually during the years of high school, but on occasion we do get a college set or a post-high school graduation story. So what goes into the decision-making process on deciding the age of a character and whether or not the story is firmly set in those high school years or afterwards? And are these conversations that writers should be having with their editors and agents?
Well, I can jump in and take this on, kind of get a little bit from the author perspective and the agent perspective. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to doing it both ways, and this is definitely a conversation that writers should have with their agents, because because I think there's a lot of similar stories you can tell where the characters are either in high school or college. There's often similar themes and similar experiences across those age groups, but there's also some really important differences. And I think right now, just from a marketing standpoint, it can be a little easier to show where a YA book fits on the market because you have more comp titles and you have more sales data. So I think for me, if a client came to me and said, hey, I have this contemporary story and I'm wondering, should I set it in high school or college? I would say set it in college if there's a reason to set it in college. Like, is there an aspect of the story that needs to be set in college that makes it a lot better when it's set in college? Because that will give the industry something to talk about. That'll give editors and sales teams and booksellers a little more to talk about with the book. And so I think that's really it. Because of how the market is right now, I think if you're going to write something set in college, it should be a purposeful choice, and you should be talking that over with your agent and editor about what you can really get out of choosing that setting.
So I think one thing that makes a big difference with where you set it, I mean, the biggest reason that this category of new adult, which I know we'll probably talk about more in a little bit, kind of didn't take off in the way that a lot of people had hoped it would, was that there wasn't that bookstore space, which is why it's really important to have those like marketing related conversations. So I did set a book in college, as I mentioned, and I self-published it because, first of all, it was during that bigger new adult boom when self-publishing really was kind of the best and smartest way to do it. And you don't need the bookstore space because people are primarily buying them digitally anyway. My book is, priced at $3.99. My Cool for the Summer is $10.99. It's, a different choice that you make catering to your market, but it was also very fitting in what was big in new adult at the time, which was romance. That was what I wanted to write. I didn't write it just so I could self-publish. Like, that's what I like to write. So I was able to do that. And I wanted to write a story where the characters were in a very independent place. And I think that makes a really big difference. When you do young adult versus new adult or high school versus college, is what's their surroundings like? Family can be very involved in young adult stories. And often when you set in college, it's because you want them to be more on their own, because you want family to not necessarily be a factor. Sort of like setting books in the 80s so you don't have to factor in cell phones, but it helps. So I think that plays in a lot. I still think self-publishing can be a good move for the right kind of college set book, but there's definitely space for them in young adult, and we've definitely seen them in young adult, and it's cool. I really hope we keep seeing them. The trickier part is more like when characters are 20 as opposed to freshmen. So yeah, mixed bag. Definitely always talk to whoever's on your team about whatever you do. At the time, I also wasn't agented, so I was very free to make whatever decisions I wanted to from that business perspective. But I would say the number one thing is like the center of who is going to, what external people are going to affect your main character's story will have a lot to do with if you want to use, high school or high school adjacent versus a college setting.
And I think, sorry, go ahead, Arvin.
No, go ahead, Kiel.
I was going to say from the editor perspective, it's a little different because when I was getting manuscripts, I wasn't, planning from the beginning with authors. I was getting them when they were already written. So I had to kind of assess, is this a YA or an adult based on an already written book? And for me, it was a lot of like what Dahlia was saying, is it set in freshman year? And what Zabe was saying too, is there a reason why it's set in college? And I think there's a lot of, YA is about a lot of new experiences, a lot of firsts, and you still have a lot of firsts, especially in freshman year, and especially for queer books. That's a lot of, opportunity for kids to get away from their parents and their families who, might be keeping them in the closet or might be unsafe. So they have an opportunity to explore themselves more. So you still have opportunities to, just explore those first times, or even if they're already out maybe a first-time breakup or the first time they're away from their boyfriend or girlfriend. So you have those opportunities, but then slowly but surely it can kind of start creeping into adult space when the adult experiences are more and more. So that was my assessment. Does this feel YA still? Do these characters still feel young enough to fit the market? And will they have a YA readership?
I also just think there are so many teens out there who want to be more independent, who crave that independence, and who can't wait to go away to college or go on a big trip or just get away from their small town or their conservative family or something like that. And so, I mean, two of my 3 books have been runaway stories with, where the kid's family and school life are largely absent. And I think that is largely because as a teenager, I wanted to run away so badly. And so it's escapist in that sense. And I always wanted to be around adults. I just thought that adults had it all figured out, and I so didn't have it all figured out. And so that's another theme, I think, in my young adult and a lot of other young adult novels that I love. It's realizing that adults, as mature as they may seem, don't have it all figured out. So I love the idea of asking yourself, what is their family life like? How independent are they really? Because that can also get you to write young adults that isn't in high school or around other people their age, but for that kind of escapist desire to be independent reason. And I think teens, especially queer teens, need those escapist stories where they get to be out there and discover themselves around a found family or a new environment or people who accept them or something like that. So, I mean, I finally, the book that I'm writing right now is adult, and that's just because there was really no way to configure it into young adult. It's currently, it's my Untitled Sugar Daddy novel. So that really wouldn't have worked as YA, but I mean, that's really the privilege of you writing for teenagers, that you get to attempt to reflect their lives and the feelings and emotions they go through, and then also give them an escape.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it is very much The Summer of Everything. When I first wrote it, wasn't even young adult. It was an adult novel because I did not, like Dahlia said, I didn't think there was space on the shelf for things I wanted to discuss. But it's also like the second book I wrote before I was even published with my first book. So it was a lot of fun times to just kind of experiment with stuff. And it ended up being my third book because I really just wasn't sure where I was going with the story at the time, and I had felt stronger feelings for my other book that came out before. But the more I talked to my editor about it, the more we realized that these themes that I'm talking about, they do kind of cross that gap between what we consider like adult and young adult, and those experiences are things that aren't talked about, I feel, enough in the young adult space. Once high school is over, it's like, so then do I just transition to adults and just reading adult books and those experiences? No, there's a whole umbrella of experiences that are going to happen in there that need to be talked about. So we decided on young adult just because I wanted more for queer readers. I wanted more for BIPOC readers. I wanted more for those readers who don't have anything in that space right now, where it's just like, okay, I lived this life in high school, which for most of us is very much in this set rudimentary thing, for whether it's for safety or just to survive high school. And then all of a sudden you're just thrown into the word. And I was like, well, like Arvin said, well, what if you do mess up? What if this happens? What if things don't go to plan, and all of a sudden you're an adult and it's on you to make sure that it does go this way? How do we talk about these things? And so I would love to just see more of that for readers, where it's just like, we're not telling you have to fit into this mold or that mold. You can exist in that space in between and still have things that are relatable, but also things that are encouraging to you.
So that some of you touched on some pieces of the next question I had, which is that some college age and post high school books, they are shelved as young adult, and while others are kind of classified as new adult, where those spaces exist, or adult fiction. And one thing that actually comes to mind is TS, a book you worked on, Burn It All Down, which technically focuses on a high school student, but it's shelved as adult. So then what are the defining lines between YA, new adult, and adult, especially from a marketing and publishing standpoint?
I think, from my perspective as an editor, I was, after that first boom and seeing how it went, I think a lot of editors put new adult out of their heads and said, it's either got to be YA or adult. And I think that was because it was very kind of specific genre that worked for new adult, and like Dahlia was saying, on the internet, because there was no shelf space in the stores for that. And in terms of Burn It All Down, when I was considering that for acquisition, that was pitched to me as teen, and I fell in love with it just as the story that it was. And really, the idea of publishing it as adult came after I was at Patterson, so one of our acquisitions processes was sending it to James Patterson and asking him if he was on board, and he was the one who said, I really think this would work for an adult audience. Nick was pushing boundaries, which I loved, and I love pushing boundaries in YA. But Jim Patterson really felt like we don't want to run into any gatekeepers who are going to keep this from readers. So let's just make it adult. We had to work on in edits making the character a little bit more adult. I think he always was, right after graduation, he was 18. But we in revisions tried to focus on giving him a little bit more of an adult experience and not maybe holding him back the way you might a teen, or and his journey is with his mother. His mother is his best friend. She was a young mother, so we kind of fleshed her out more as well, and showed the adult perspective from her. She's pretty young and making mistakes almost in the way a teen is as well, but showing her perspective and in a place where she's the parent. She has to be more protective. She has to think about her child, whereas Joey, the teen character, he doesn't have to think about anybody but himself, and his own growth. So I think those were the big differences from the first draft through the final.
I think of new adult as the way that like coming of age is kind of a subgenre of young adult. I think of new adult as being the coming of age subgenre of adult. Like people really tried to fix it to like, oh, it means if the main character is 18 to 25. And then I read Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers, which is fantastic. And I'm like, no, this is like perfect queer new adult, and the main character is 28, turns 29 in the middle of the book. And it just, I have never been good at articulating what makes something specifically that, but it's not just the cusp of adolescence to adulthood. It's like adolescence is behind you. I mean, it's certainly in that book, she's like a grad student, and it's like very, what next? And what responsibilities do I have now, and what responsibilities do I have to myself, and how do I fit in the world as an adult? And all these things kind of, I think, go in new adult in a way that I don't think of as being young adult. But then there are things published as YA where I'm like, what? This is like so incredibly exactly what like new adult is, to the point where I think it should have been published as adult, and then it becomes YA anyway. And I'm thinking of specific books, but they're not queer, so I won't mention them here. But like, I just, I'm a little boggled sometimes by the choices, and I think sometimes it depends on the author and their notoriety and whether publishing really cares about them getting to be in the YA space, and they'll make exceptions for that they won't make for other people. And all of this sounds like criticism. I don't mean it to sound like criticism, but I think sometimes what blurs the lines is that happens. That publishing puts a lot into platform, and they make certain allowances for certain authors who might have a little more celebrity for one reason or another, and then other people don't understand, like, how come that can be YA, but my book can't be YA? And it's like, well, because you don't have 100,000 Twitter followers and 7 different places where you get to write articles and get coverage all over. So, it's a little messy, but that's, to me, the definition of like coming of age in adolescence versus like coming of age as an adult. Once I thought of it that way, I also stopped being bothered by that new adult is like not really a category. I'm like, it's coming of age adult. That's what it is, and I feel good with that. I like that.
I like that. I mean, I keep thinking of. I mean, one of my favorite books that I read during the pandemic was Such a Fun Age, which is about a 25-year-old going on 26, and her coming of age story, and kind of like themes of class and race, and also just dealing with having to like get off her parents' healthcare and like figure out what her next step is going to be. And that was literary fiction, and it's Kylie Reed, she's an MFA from Iowa. It's a beautifully written book, but also really, really well paced. and voicey and well written. So it's, I mean, there are exceptions to everything. We're like, it really is literary fiction deserves all the accolades and all the praise. But you know, we talk about race and class and YA, and we have amazing writing in YA. And you know, in new adult, you're saying that it's also that same kind of like 18 to 25 grown up coming of age category. So much of it, I mean, it really does come down to just the nuances of how a publisher wants to market that book and that author. And I guess also just some X factor that like we can't even put our finger on.
Yeah.
That's what it is for me. There's things that I can't necessarily say, okay, this is the definitive thing that makes it this, that makes that, but I can say that it drives me absolutely bonkers that the main thing we look at is the age of the character to define what these things are. And it's almost like, okay, but then we have to look at the whole gamut, like what age classifies you as an adult in America versus what age classifies you as an adult over, you know, in Europe and all these other places. We can't just limit it to, you know, what Americans see as, okay, this is the age of an adult. So this is where we're going to shelve it as, because you have readers looking at from all different places. And so that's what really bothers me, on top of the fact that, like Dahlia said, there's different experiences you have when you are coming of age as an adult versus coming of age as a young adult. And the last part of that word is adult. So it does not have to stop at 18. It's not young teen, it's young adult. So when you hit 20, you're still an adult, but you're still a young adult, because the mistakes I made at 20, I probably could have made at 15 also. And so it sucks that we're just saying, okay, well, but you hit that cutoff point where all of a sudden you're classified in this other way. So there are a lot of just like intangible things that kind of define it, but I don't think there should be one set of laws that definitely says, okay, this is how it should be and it shouldn't.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important, especially for queer books, because I think for a lot of queer people, we often experience coming of age and coming into ourselves, you know, a little later in life. You know, when you're a queer teenager and you're seeing everyone around you, like, oh, getting their first crushes, like going on their first dates. And you often, you know, unless you're very lucky to grow up in a very safe and accepting setting, you know, it's a lot, like sometimes you just don't know who you are and how you want to like interact with the world around you. And so I think for a lot of queer people, that whole coming of age happens later in life. You know, I have my adult debut coming out next year. It's a fantasy novel, and I've always like I know we're talking a lot about contemporary, but for me, like, even though the main character is 26, I've always thought that kind of had a new adult feel to it, even though, you know, it's not in college, it's in this fantasy world, and the main character isn't 23, 24. But yeah, I really do like that definition of coming of age, because, you know, that's what I was trying to write in that book, was to write a coming of age story that felt like YA, but with a little more sex and a little more, you know, complicated content. And I think it's really important to look at themes and content, you know, besides the age. And I think what TF brought up about kind of editing a YA book to be adult is also really helpful, because as an agent, you know, what really signals YA to me is it's not just the teenager speaking, but it's a teenager speaking kind of in the moment. It feels very much like, I'm a teenager, I'm talking to you as a teenager, as things happen to me, and I'm experiencing them for the first time. And then kind of in adult fiction, it's kind of a little more of an adult view on teen life. And so you have a little more, the narrator is kind of a little more aware, a little more mature, and has had more life experience. And so that's kind of what I'm looking for in determining what is YA and what is an adult voice. Is not necessarily like the age of the character, but it's how aware they are of their own life experience and how aware they are of their place in the world.
Yeah, and something that almost I think all of you just kind of said makes me want to skip ahead a little bit to a question I had a little bit later for kind of the idea of coming of age stories. And college years can be so formative, especially for queer people, many of whom, you know, are afraid to come out in high school or can't because of safety reasons. And one of the most common phrases that I personally am sick of hearing is people are tired of coming out stories. Because in reality, there's so many different coming out stories that we've not gotten to hear yet. And, I think there's space for all of them. So I want to know, what are some of the differences that go into writing coming of age and coming out stories set in high school versus college and, in the 20s, the new adult bracket? What are the differences that going into creating those stories?
So going back to the, having more independence versus having less independence. So are you coming out living under somebody else's roof? And if so, how closeted can you be, and how safe can you be, and what kinds of decisions do you have to make about coming out? And how many times does that mean you have to come out, and how protective can you be over, certain things, and how much is the internet going to factor in? I mean, I think it's much, much bigger in YA. And I honestly think it should be even bigger in YA. I mean, look at all of us and how much time we all spend online. But how much having to reach outside your current physical zone is, in order to find queer community is going to be a thing? Or are there, GSAs or whatever your equivalent is in school? I see that appearing in YA books a lot now. And that's not something, in college set books, I see much less of that. You can kind of just they're often more like finding your people in a less sanctioned way, in a less hesitant way. Obviously none of these things are across the board, and these things are going to depend on so many factors about who you are and where you are and your safety and your race and a billion different things. But I think, on the whole, all these things with how, that again come down to how much freedom you have and are allowed, and how much independence you have and are allowed, and how much you control your own safety, and how much you can go looking and where you can go looking. We're talking about the importance of the older end of YA, but I actually think the younger end of YA is horribly underdone. And there's this, the only book off the top of my head that has a 14-year-old main character is Anything Could Happen by Will Walton. And there's a scene where I don't remember exactly what it is, but I think it's a dad has to drive them on a date or something. And it's just, what if you can't get around by yourself? What if you are, to have your life, your dependence on somebody getting you there? It's a very different experience than when you're in college or you're in a big city and you have public transportation and you're free to go wherever you want. I mean, so the amount that you are dependent on other people to find your community is a vast difference. So I think that is something that can really have huge, huge differences between, something that's set in high school, especially early high school, and something that is set later.
I think it's definitely about the difference for me is the places that you're put in by other people or other people's decisions, and the places that you get to choose for yourself, or the places that you have fully committed to being in. And that, for me, is the difference in telling those kind of coming out stories. But then again, you could look at it from several different angles, and there are people who are adults who are still in settings where someone else is controlling, the position that they're in, versus with younger teens and whatnot, who some of them have that kind of independence. Dahlia nailed it on the head, where it's not just you're looking at just one set of things, but you're looking at, race, ability, all these other things play into a factor in, how those stories are going to be told also. But for me, that definitely kind of nails down what it is. It's the ability to choose where you are and where you're going with things, and someone else making those decisions for you, and that kind of controls how that narrative can go.
I will say, every YA book I've written, I've always had to go in later and kind of layer in those people who control the person, just because from the get-go I want my characters to be fiercely independent in that escapist way that I wish I could have been as a teenager. But you're right, Julian, because there are people who control you in certain senses, whether it's your teachers, your principals, your parents. And so, yeah, it's always kind of a fun editing project after the fact and later rounds of revision to go in and be like, okay, so they're running away here, or they're skipping school there, but what do the parents think? Are they calling? Where, what are the consequences of these actions? So yeah, it's a very defining part of YA. And yeah, it's what makes it realistic.
And then also kind of going off of something ZR said a little earlier, post-high school years, especially in queer stories, are often ones of great sexual awakening. And one of the major differences between high school stories and those that come after high school is, content, and oftentimes sex is at the center of those conversations regarding age demographic. And queer sex often gets labeled dirty. And that could obviously contribute to sales, appeal, marketability, and shelving. And so do you think realistic on-the-page queer sex has a place in these stories? And how is the best way to kind of approach having those things on the page?
I think there is definitely a place on the page. I remember when I was a young editor and I was very much like, we shouldn't be going into those details. These are children's books. And I think the more I got comfortable as a queer editor and the more I got comfortable pushing boundaries and really advocating for not just my authors and the queer readers, but also what I was looking for as a queer teen that, now I had the power to bring into the market. The freer I felt. And I used to say, anything goes as long as the reader can't use the scene as porn, basically, but I think even from that point, my perspective has changed. I worked with Robin Talley on a book where her very specific goal for her book was to write on the page queer female sex, to just show what it was like so that those teens who were, wanting to have those experiences could read about them and get a realistic sense of what goes on, because that is the time where these readers are thinking about exploring those things. They're starting to explore those things, and they should be able to see those scenes. I don't necessarily know if I've gotten to a place where I have a hard and fast rule about what should be shown or what shouldn't be, but I think always approaching it from the perspective of, is this doing a service to the teen reader? Is this, does it feel frivolous? And if it's frivolous, is it for a purpose? I think even what Zabe said about thinking about why you're setting something in college, I think the same thing for a sex scene. Is it important that you're showing this, and why? What is the purpose? Even if it's kind of just a fun, fluffy scene. But I'm still exploring as an editor and now as an agent what I think is where the line is.
Yeah, I mean, YA used to have a whole reputation as like the fade to black age category, and I think that is so not the case anymore. And I agree with your line, TS, about like as long as it's not something that they could be like using as, I mean, it's like a substitute of porn, because I guess the book and it should have literary merit. But I mean, aside from that, anything goes, and I love that because I feel like in sort of straight books, anything has gone for a while, which was great. I mean, I remember like, Looking for Alaska had that blowjob scene, which I think a lot of us and a lot of young people were kind of like, oh my God, this is an YA book back in 2005, which is amazing. But, queer books should absolutely have those same scenes and more. And I think we're getting that now. So yeah, definitely not the fade to black age category, or at least it doesn't have to be.
All my books have had sex in them, pretty sure. And Under the Lights, which I published in 2015 when like Fade to Black was still pretty much the most prominent, if there was sex at all, was quite graphic, not in a titillating way. But I wanted to be able to, in addition to the fact that I had done it in heterosexual books, so why not? I wanted to, give queer readers the same kind of scene, if I was allowed to do it in behind the scenes and I was allowed to do it in Just Visiting, which came out later, but I wrote first, then I should be allowed to do it in Under the Lights. And I was, and I waited for them to tell me like, no, you can't show that. And that never came. So I think that was a small press perk. I don't think if I was with a big publisher at the time, I would have been allowed to do that. There are definitely some small press perks. But I really loved the idea of giving queer readers that scene that was a little more equivalent to what was already out there. And I also loved the idea of giving frameworks for things they might not get elsewhere. Like, you're not necessarily going to get sex education, you know, queer sex education at home or at school. So if you can get Our Own Private Universe, which is Robin's book, or Jack of Hearts by, you know, Lev Rosen, or something like that, you know, you'll learn something from someone who cares, that you learn it right, and you see what it looks like modeled somewhere. So for me, consent was a really big one, and, you know, just consent and comfort and romance and having it be like a sex scene and anything else was really important to me there. Since then, I have pulled back more just because I write what I feel like fits for the book. But I definitely think that there are real places for it, you know, partly just because it's fun and it's something that plenty of teens want to read, but partly to give frameworks for what these things can, should, might look like, that you're not necessarily going to see in any media or learn in school or be able to ask your parents about, even if they're super open. So I like the idea of giving it that, but obviously it's not right for every book, or for every author. So
yeah, and I think there's just so many experiences, especially like queer experiences, that you just haven't been, well, that kids might not have honest information on any other way. You know, one big thing when I was writing May the Best Man Win is that I really wanted to like be honest and open about Jeremy, one of the main characters. He's a trans boy. He's just started testosterone, and that has a major effect on your sex drive and on your body. And but you know, there's not a lot of honest information out there about what that experience is and what that feels like. So, you know, there's like, oh, clinical medical stuff, and then there's like, you know, random articles on the internet. But you know, I put a lot of very like personal stuff into like writing the main character. It's like, oh, like, did you know that a trans guy could get a boner? And I'm like, obviously, like, I am putting the word boner in this YA novel, which are a big part of the teenage boy experience that is not actually talked about a lot in YA. And so I thought it was really important for me to, you know, kind of be honest and be nitty-gritty and talk about like my characters and what's going on with their bodies, because there isn't anything out there for teenagers that's like, if you have this experience, you know, if you choose to transition in this way, like, this is what it might feel like. And so there's all sorts of, I think people assume that like a sex scene in YA is just there to be like titillating or pornographic, but I think a lot of times it's just there to give teenagers a mirror they can look into and kind of see their own experiences with sex and their bodies and growing up reflected. Because you know, sex and sexuality is a big part of a lot of teenagers' lives, and I think we do them a disservice when we cover it up and pretend that natural, normal things that teenagers are going through are somehow dirty.
Yeah. I love, I mean, he phrased this so much more eloquently, but there's a James Baldwin quote about how novelists are basically historians of feelings, because you made this point about how there are plenty of like clinical and medical accounts. And sure, maybe you have some like articles out there that are more anecdotal from journalists, but like, I mean, you are there and we are all there to kind of like document exactly what it's like to be a queer person and feel like a queer person right now in history, and sort of like to put those feelings out there. And I love that sort of about young adults, and novelists in general. And I also love that about social media right now, that we're getting those same like documentarians of feelings on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube too, just to kind of make very clear, like, not only over here, but like, this is how it feels to live as this person, to live as me at this time in history. So, yeah.
I find it so, I think when we try to censor or try to withhold on things like sex and YA, it is way more harmful than it is helpful to readers. And just to bring it back to your question, like, it really does make them feel like their experience is wrong, that they shouldn't be doing these things, they shouldn't feel these things, their body shouldn't have these kind of reactions, or even from the other side where they think these are things I don't want to do. But I'm glad that I know about them from this perspective versus like, ZR and Arvin saying, versus me like clicking on an ad on, YouTube, and this is how the doctor tells me these things are supposed to go. Like that's just, thank you for the information, appreciate the facts, but also this is not like, that's not all that goes into this experience. It takes away the emotional value also. So for me, it's very much like we're not writing, at least I hope we're not writing for some kind of pure adult entertainment, but we're writing from the perspective of these things are going to happen. You're going to have these feelings. Your body's going to feel this way. It's going to react this way. It's okay. You are very much normal. And when we take that out and we try to sanitize it and whatnot, it is very much giving them the message that this is how you are supposed to exist as a queer person. And I think that's very harmful to readers.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of turn back a little bit towards new adult again. There's a huge discoverability issue when trying to find college set books or post-high school books, mostly just because, as we've been discussing, like some of them are in YA, some of them are in adult, and some of them are in the romance section, some of them are in, the fictions. So it can be hard to discover and find these stories. And a lot of people, especially within the queer adult, new adult genre, see queer books and automatically assume erotica, or as TikTok likes to call, spicy, which is a whole weird word to use. But is this the case? And how does that fit into new adult? And I'd love to talk a little bit more about how, I know, Dahlia, you talked about it a little bit, how that age category sprung up. Do you think there's a place for it still? And how does it work into the whole picture of publishing?
I'm sticking with embracing it in adult as a coming of age subgenre. I've been working on it now for a while. I've been working on all my posts for a while. So I also blog for BuzzFeed Books, and one day they posted on Instagram something about new adult, but it was like clear that it was coming from like they'd heard the term and weren't quite sure what it was. So I said, I'm like, this is something with which I'm actually like really familiar. Do you want me to write like a post of books? So anyway, I haven't finished it, but I'm turning it into a post of like, I don't call it new adult. I think I called it like adult coming of age books, but it's all books that are kind of like around that area. So like Such a Fun Age, as you described, would fit. I haven't read it yet. But like Black Buck, for example, was like a recent book that I read that I would 1,000% put there. That's so good. And so I have, so it's a collection of like YAs set in college or college age characters, and books that were originally published as new adult, and adult books that I think fit into that space. And it's funny because I was thinking before, ZR, you mentioned just specifically the age 26 when you were talking about your adult fantasy, and Julian, you mentioned like kind of the American bubble, and I feel like 26 as the insurance deadline did something for, at least in the American bubble, 26 actually being kind of like an adulthood line, because that's where like the American healthcare system is telling you you're an adult on your own.
To get your shit together.
And I feel it pushed the line out to 26. So, I think kind of anything around that space, and certainly an issue like insurance, is something that's fit for new adult lit. It is definitely hard to find because it spans all those categories, but I hope this post helps people find it.
Yeah, and I do think like from. Oh, go on.
Oh no, I was just going to quickly say, and that's also one of the reasons I love the Alex Awards, because I think the Alex Awards often highlight that exact sweet spot. That's like, adult books that are really perfect for YA readers who want those coming of age stories. Anyway, VR.
Oh yeah, I was just like from a bookstore standpoint, I do like that was one of the issues new adult originally faced in getting off the ground, was like, how do we shelf this in bookstores? And like, I love bookstores. I've been going on to a lot of them lately, signing copies of my book. And young adult is a massive, massive section within most bookstores. And so I'm like, part of me thinks, I worry, like, do we really have enough physical retail space in, especially indie bookstores, to accommodate like an equally sized section for new adult. But I think one thing I'd really love publishers to do is focus more on new adult as a marketing tag, as part of a book's metadata, to use a technical term, and to talk to sales teams and talk to bookstore book buyers and sales reps and be like, hey, like, this is a book that it would be really great to to push to like college age readers, younger readers who come in and say, hey, like, I want a book set in college, or readers who are like, hey, like, I'm just aging out of YA, like, where do I go next? So I'm not sure if new adult could having like a separate section for it might be the right way to do it, but I want it's that to be part of the appeal of a book that publishers are aware of, and to then use that knowledge of that appeal to help push the book. Some of the we're kind of in a golden age right now of adult science fiction and fantasy that features queer characters, and I think a lot of it, I'm thinking of The Unbroken, which is a great sapphic fantasy novel by C.L. Clarke that just came out, and like that's something that I think, okay, like let's say you read the action. Let's say you're a teenager and you love Children of Blood and Bone, and you loved An Ember in the Ashes, and you love that book, and it's like, okay, like now I'm in college and I want an adult fantasy that gives me these same feels and has these queer characters, but like is like a little older and has like characters in their early mid-20s kind of coming of age in that way. Then I think for booksellers and for marketing teams to be like, hey, like, this is tagged as new adult, like this is something that we can use not only to like sell this book, but to like bring to kind of introduce like new adult readers to the wider adult book section. I think that's where new adult can be most helpful in book sales.
Yeah, I agree. And in the meantime, we should all just go to Dahlia's website.
Come on over.
Yeah, you'll have to with this panel, you'll have to share the link to Dahlia's blog post, the BuzzFeed
it'll
post,
be
when it goes up.
below.
Oh yeah, I gotta work on that, but I have to do the summer LGBTQAYA first, because that's more attached to a time thing. I know I have a lot, but I have spent so much time on LGBTQ reads lately. I'm behind on everything else. And I turned in my second book on Monday, so
Yay!
It's been a lot. But yes, I will work on that post. I'm feeling the urgency for it right now. This is very inspirational.
And I can speak from personal experience and from just kind of what I'm seeing, because I spend far too much time on TikTok, unfortunately. Readers are and so desperate for stories about queer, messy 20-somethings. That is what everybody, that is what I've seen. That's what I want. So what can kind of be done to help close this gap between the like 18-year-old moving into college and, kind of the literary fiction, adult fiction that already exists? What can be done to kind of close the gap between those two genres, to include, all different types of stories?
More YA writers. What is it, Dahlia?
Oh, I was just saying, like, books are there. They're just, because they're not, for example, tagged new adult, like, it's kind of hard to yank them out. And that's the point of, my running the website, but this, goes slowly. I literally, like, home cover copy looking for ages mentioned in the books, but, like, messy 20-somethings are, all over, like, queer adult fiction. It's just, it's hard to dig it out of whatever else there is in queer adult fiction. So, sorry, but Arvin, yeah.
I was just going to say more YA writers writing adult novels. So, I mean, that's what I'm doing right now. But I'm thinking of a non-queer example, is a book that was huge last year, in 5 years. And that's by Rebecca Searle. And that's about like a kind of like messy 20-something-year-old and everything going on in her life. But I mean, the book I'm writing right now is an adult novel about a very messy 21 to 26-year-old who basically hustle a sugar daddy. It's kind of like a gayer, talented Mr. Ripley meets Sally Rooney, I guess is the pitch. So, I mean, Dahlia's right. Those books are out there and they're being written, and a lot of them are being written by YA authors. So you just kind of have to look for them.
If you could drop that into my email, that would be.
Well, let me finish writing it first.
I'll be patient. Just put me at the top of the ARC list. That's all
I think, yeah, there's a lot of books out there. I think it's going to take more than Dahlia thinking about them, or what I often see,
especially because I don't know how to use TikTok. I tried. I'm sorry. I'm terrible at it. I can't learn new things. I'm too old.
I also think it's more than the authors saying, "Hey, just a reminder, this is not YA," and it's so hard because then they have to say this is adult, and then people automatically check out and think, "Oh, it's not going to be relatable to me." And I think that's, of course, goes back to us having this new adult is so important to me, at least. But yeah, it's going to take more than just small voices here and there, or one voice here and there saying, "Hey, this is not YA, this is adult." It's going to take people saying, if you are kind of like what ZR was saying earlier, if you are a fan of XYZ NYA, here is this adult novel that has these elements and things like that. I just think it's so much more than people writing the books, because they're writing them and they're out there, and it takes me forever to find them because they're buried in all these other books that have come out that are set in very much adult things. That more power to you, go over there. But then there's that space right there it's just not labeled, I think, in a way that is going to attract readers.
I mean, 3 books that come to mind. I was just going to say, like there's Red, White, and Royal Blue, Call Me By Your Name, and A Little Light. And queer YA readers love those 3 books, and they're all technically adult books. I remember Casey McCliston, they were so proud when they won an Alex Award for Red, White, and Royal Blue. And I think that's because they recognize that, it is so appealing to young queer readers. So they're out there.
And we're seeing, I think, Honey Girl and One Last Stop have been the 2 big ones of this year, which are both fantastic books. So it is nice to see it happen. But yeah, it's a few books every year, and then everybody clamors for more, and there needs to be more. If you love these, look at these, and there is just not enough of that kind of coverage. It's lovely to see these books everywhere, but there's just not enough where to go next after you've read the 3 big ones of the year and loved them. Then what? And
it's interesting because that kind of overlap I see actually a ton on TikTok. On Book Talk it exists, and I see a lot. I've seen so many videos that are if you like this YA, you'll like this. But I think it's harnessed because that's what the kind of demographic I've fallen in onto TikTok. It's just harnessing those people and bringing them over to LGBTQ Reads and bringing them over to Bookstagram and bringing them over because, and again, a lot of it is such books that you can find on Kindle Unlimited, books that you can find in the more indies that you might not find on bookstores. So it's just harnessing because the audience is there. I've seen them. They exist. It's just kind of harnessing them and showing them that there's more.
Right. And I think the issue is publishers don't seem to want to work with them.
Well, publishers really harness TikTok yet.
That's I think the number one problem.
TikTok's algorithm is also a very capitalistic structure where it's very winner takes all. And so I think you see these small handful of books that everyone is doing that. If you like this, then you like this too. But it really is the same small handful when there are so many more. But that's largely because the algorithm, again, I think it's just super
what I
capitalistic
found is
just
you have to trick the algorithm. You're here's Red, White, and Royal Blue, and then here's all these other books that you haven't heard of. You have to trick it.
But there are never books I haven't heard of, when I do watch them. Here's what I know. Whatever I have read, I will love They Both Die at the End. And I do love They Both Die at the End. But it came out in 2017, and it's now the biggest book in the country because of Book Talk. And I'm I can't find something new in 2021 when you've discovered a 2017 book. I think it's 2017. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. Which is no shade. I am thrilled for whenever Adam Silvera gets discovered by whoever. I think he is phenomenal, and I love that book. But it is a lot of the same books, and they're not new books per se. But when a new book takes off, it's something incredible. She Drives Me Crazy by Kelly Quinlan, apparently took off from 1 or 2 videos, and then it's huge and sold out the first print run immediately. You couldn't get it anywhere a week after it came out. And that's wild. This is her 3rd book, and the first 2 were also great, but this was TikTok, so it took off, and it's interesting. the whole thing is interesting, and I wish publishers would dig into it more, but I think they feel like it's going to disappear and they don't want to like deal with it or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think just one broader thing I wanted to add about the structure of adult publishing is not as diverse as the structure of YA publishing. You know, I think there's been, especially with We Need Diverse Books, there's been such a strong push in YA and in children. So the thing is that in publishing, the children's side of editorial and adult side are often completely separate. So it's separate teams, it's separate employees. You know, editors kind of have to choose, do I want to work on YA middle grade picture book, all the children's books, or do I want to work in adult? And so the vast majority of the queer editors, BIPOC editors I know are working in children's editorial, to say nothing about marketing, about sales, about all the different teams that come together to make a book. And so I think one reason you specifically don't see queer books pushed as heavily in the adult space is because you don't have that same level of power across an adult imprint to make that push for those books. And I think we're in a time where, and this is just from my own experience, you know, working in genre, I work at a lot of different adult genres, and there's kind of this, and so we're starting to see those areas open up. You know, we're starting to see more diverse publishing professionals be hired. But I think one thing readers can do if they want more queer stories to succeed in adult is to buy them and to also, you know, speak openly about wanting to see more diverse publishing professionals in adult fiction, because I think the public pressure to diversify is working in children's imprints, and we should keep up that same energy and continue advocating for diversity and representation in adult publishing.
I have to imagine there's a misconception in adult publishing that they're often catering to book club books, because those are a lot of times the books that'll like sell really tremendously. And there's probably this, idea that book club readers are largely women, largely white, right? And so I think it's just like you're saying, like let's just like scream even louder about being diverse people who want diverse adult books.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if it's like, oh, like all the book club books will be books that only cater to white women, then you're only going to get white women forming book clubs. So like, I think one thing that's been really interesting is to see, like, say, Reese Witherspoon has started a book club, and she's been really pushing more diverse titles. You know, Oprah has always been there pushing these diverse titles in adult. And so just leaning more into that direction and kind of looking at what makes adult different from YA, and looking at how we can bring more diverse readers and diverse publishing professionals into that area, I think it's not only going to be good for the quality of the books, but I think it's also going to open new opportunities for the business.
And We Need Diverse Books is spreading the wealth. They just recently partnered with Reese's Book Club on a program. And so I love that, because you're right, that I do a lot of those structures that have given us so many diverse YA books are in the kidlit world. So I love that at least We Need Diverse Books is kind of like sharing all of their knowledge and expertise and resources with Reese's Book Club on that program. So hopefully more of that.
Well, amazing. So I think my last question for the group of you is, what advice could you give to aspiring writers or publishing industry professionals that they would like to work in publishing, who want to work on or write, post-high school, college, kind of in this demographic?
Read it. I know that's the most annoying. Everyone gives it advice, but like, how else are you going to know why in something that's like not an easy sell, these are the books that worked? So read, like, sorry, got to give some book recommendations. Let's Talk About Love by Claire Can, By Any Means Necessary by Cam Montgomery. Like, you got to know why those authors were able to do this with those books, why that worked. Julian's book, when it comes out, yay, 2022 seems very far away.
Forever.
But but like check those out and see why they work and how it works for YA. I mean, you can't know 100%, but yeah, read them is always my first. See what works, see what's already out there, see what you know can contribute and what you think publishing needs. You know, I find that inspirational generally. So
it's got to be a little bit of it's very easy to say versus to do, which is to kind of be fearless. You know, if you're not seeing it, first I have to totally agree with Don. You got to read first. Don't just assume that it hasn't been done, because it has.
definitely don't
It probably
say.
has. Yes, no one was doing it, so I'm just going to do it myself. No, it's not always the case. But if someone hasn't done it in a way that you can do it, then you have to kind of be fearless and write it. And because you're never going to know if you're going to be able to exist in that space if you're not willing to put in the work to tell the story. You can't just go in with this plan like, okay, I'm going to write this story to the market and whatnot. Market changes all the time. And some of these books that I love dearly right now, probably if we went back like 5 years and maybe even less than that, would not be as big as they are now. Not that people weren't craving it, but the attention might not have been put there. And social media is just constantly growing. So we didn't have the things that we have now back then. But you kind of have to be fearless and write the book, because if you don't do it, then what do you have to, to kind of reach for? What goals you have to push on other people and say, is this going to work? How can we make this better? How can I make this successful? So yeah, you have to kind of do the work. I hate saying that because I don't want to do the work myself.
Speaking of the work and being fearless, one of my favorite quotes that I've heard on a panel is from Cheryl Klein, who's an editor at Lee & Low. And she describes her job as an editor as balancing the author's vision with the reader's needs. And I think that's totally a mashup of what Julie and Dahlia just said, which is that you have to be fearless and write the story as you see it, as you want to write it. I mean, be true to your vision 100%. But then also you need to be aware of what's going on. You need to read in your age category. And eventually, I mean, especially when you're partnering with an agent and an editor, you have to kind of bring in your reader's needs or the industry's needs or whatever without compromising your vision and the reason you want to tell the story, the truth of your story. You know, a lot of times when it gets to the nitty gritty of editing, I think that means like, pacing and readability and all of that. But I think that's also just in deciding whether you're going to write an adult book, a new adult book, or an adult book. Oh my God, sorry, YA, new adult, or adult novel. And so be fearless, write the story you want to write it as truthfully as possible from the get-go. But like Dahlia is saying, you need to know what's going on. You need to know what the industry looks like, and you need to listen to people down the road, whether that's your agent or your editor or just buddies in the industry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the biggest writing advice that I tend to give, I say this a lot to my clients. I say this, and it's very general advice, but I think it's something everyone can use, is write purposefully. So think about why you're writing something, and think about why you're choosing this word over that word, or think about, what would be interesting here, and what does the reader expect, and what would the reader be intrigued by. And so just write, it's so easy when you're writing, and like we all kind of do this when you're drafting. Sometimes you just like let your brain go on autopilot because you need to get those 1,000 words for the day so that you can like go to bed. But then when you're editing and when you're revising and before you send material out, I still do this. I just go through everything, just line by line by line, sentence by sentence, scene by scene, and just make sure everything just fits that purpose I need it to serve. And so I think it is so, and part of that is, hey, take long walks, take long showers, spend time when you're cleaning your apartment, or when you're, stuck sitting on the bus. Just think about your book and think about, what different scenes and what different characters are trying to achieve, and think about how other authors do that, and figure out what the unique way is for you to tell that story. Because there's really like no editorial issue that you can face that I think just like really understanding what your purpose is and what you're trying to do can overcome.
Yeah, and I think, piggybacking on what everybody else has said, you need to be well-read, and you need to be fearless, and you need to be mindful, but you also, keep those things in mind, and don't be afraid to advocate for yourself, because there's so many voices, there's so many opinions. Your editor is going to have so many voices in their head. Maybe they'll ask you to do something that you don't necessarily agree with, and you need to kind of take all of those different things and think, do I want to stick with this? Did I do this for a reason? Is it important? Does it work with the market? Hear your editor, hear their reasons, but then if you really feel strongly, advocate, because I know there are a lot of authors out there who feel like they have to do everything that their editor asks them to do, or or they're going to get their contract canceled. And I always try to tell my author friends, you can push back, you can have a conversation, talk more deeply about why are you asking me to do this? Is there an issue that you're having that we can fix in a way that works for both of us, as opposed to the solution that you've just put forward? And I think that's really important.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much to everyone for joining me today for this conversation. Where can readers find more about you and your work on the internet?
DahliaAdler.com and LGBTQreads.com. And I also want to make really clear, I was just joking about TikTok. And I really, I'm afraid I made it sound like I was slamming anything about it. I'm really not. I think it's awesome anytime people discover a new way to spread the word about books. And I love dedication to backlist books. I'm sorry, this has just been bothering me. I think it's awesome. But you can find me, on Twitter, I'm at Miss Dalai Lama, and Instagram, I'm at Miss Dalai Lama, MissDahlelama. And LGBTQ Reads is at LGBTQ Reads everywhere.
I'm on Instagram at Arvin Amati, and then also my website, arvinamati.com.
You can find me on probably the best place to find out information about my new and upcoming projects is follow me on Twitter at ZREller. That's ZRELLOR, and buy my book if you haven't yet.
I'm also on Twitter. My handle is TEEESS. It's just TS spelled phonetically.
I am the victim of a hate crime because I can't get my own name anywhere on any social media platform. So you can find me on Twitter at JulianW_Writes, on Instagram at WintersJulian. But for all links to make it easier on you, just go to julianwinters.com. It is probably not up to date, Dahlia, but it has the things that you need.
No judgment. And for the record, I couldn't get at Dahlia Adler on Twitter. I didn't even know there were other Dahlia Adlers in the world, and somebody had at Dahlia Adler. So I feel you.
Dahlia, we're gonna get that blue check and we're gonna kick them all out.
Someday.
Amazing. And I'm Jacob. You can find me at A Very Queer Book Club on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And thank you so much for joining me and all of us for Pride Book Fest 2021.